Hello, this is Dennis Bielfeldt, President of the Institute of Lutheran Theology. The name of this course is Faith, Knowledge, and Reason, and the course basically is dealing with how philosophy does affect, has affected, and should affect the study of theology. Today we're going to be talking about Plato and his significance, Plato and his context. The English philosopher Alfred North Whitehead once said that philosophy is but a series of footnotes on Plato. And what he meant by this is that Plato advances all of the big questions that philosophers later on take stands upon. So much of the great questions of philosophy have come from the very beginning of philosophy, and certainly Plato is the source of many of them. He is one of the great philosophers, perhaps ranking with Aristotle and Kant. That might be the great triumvirate: Plato, Aristotle, and Kant. Two for the Greeks, one for the German. But definitely Plato is more playful. Now, in real life, I don't know how playful Plato was, but of course he has written dialogues that are literary, and they show a kind of lightness and a playfulness that make it the case that you can assign them to undergraduate students and they can get something out of it. Try assigning the works of Aristotle to undergraduate students and saying, go home, read this, and come back. Well, with Aristotle, it's ponderous prose. Never read it in Greek, but I can only imagine. But they are lecture notes, okay? So we have Aristotle's lecture notes and we have Plato's literary works. And so it's not maybe fair to say that Plato as a guy was more playful than Aristotle, but certainly the literature is. Kant, we know enough about Kant to know that when he was in his old age, he wasn't very playful at all. But I did read a new biography about Kant lately that shows that he was quite playful in his middle age, and definitely enjoyed the parties of Königsberg, particularly sitting next to the queen or the empress or whoever the woman was in power. But at any rate, Kant's not playful either. Plato oftentimes talked about born in 427 BC, maybe more like 429. That's kind of what I'm reading now. Who knows exactly? It doesn't really matter. But you can see he lived to be 80 to 82 years old. He was born to a well-to-do family. He studied with Socrates, very interestingly, and he was the founder of the academy in Athens. Of course, this is a very important philosophical academy, and we'll be talking about this later on in the course, the importance of that academy for Christian theology. Athens was a major center at the time. It flowered after the Persian War. The Persian War was a war that Persia tried to bring about in order to bring about victory against the Greeks. The Greeks withstood this, so the Greeks, I guess, won the Persian Wars. And after the Persian Wars, Greek culture was at its zenith. And then, unfortunately, the Peloponnesian War started 17 years after the Persian War ended, and that was pretty rough on Athens, because they finally lost the war, as you know, in 405. But certainly in this time, after the Persian War, the influence of the pre-Socratics, who we'll be talking about, was felt, and especially also the Pythagoreans. Now, the Pythagoreans followed a leader by the name of Pythagoras. Of course, there's even been those who have claimed that Pythagoras didn't live, but probably he did live. And it's very difficult to know what Pythagoras wrote and the Pythagoreans. But anyway, the Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans seem to have been very interested in numbers, even saying that all things are number. We have that statement. All things are number, and of course then we have to struggle to understand what that means exactly. They seem to believe that there were an infinite number of points on a line, and of course the Parmenides and his student Zeno took this on very strongly and said, well, this is absurd, because if so you could never move, because you'd have to pass through an infinite number of points and that would take an infinite amount of time. So, at any rate, the Pythagoreans are very important. We have the influence of the pre-Socratics. Towards the end of the Peloponnesian War, it was a little bit like the Vietnam War in Athens, I tell you. People were just really tired of war. Or maybe Berlin at the end of World War I. People were tired of war, and they didn't see this war as being heroic anymore. And a new class of people arose who questioned the verities of their ancestors. Now that happens a lot. It happened in the 1960s, right? The young, and I was young then, so I questioned the verity of my ancestor, right? I said, well, you know, what are we fighting for? 1, 2, 3, what are you fighting for? Remember that song? And so there was a lot of this going on at the time. And there were people, of course, who arose, who started to think that the old values and the old ways of doing things were just somebody else's opinion. The opinion of their forefathers, basically, right? And now you've got to remember that in Athens in these days, it was a direct democracy. Now, the last time you maybe think about direct democracy, you have to think about the guy that ran for president against Bush and Clinton, right? You remember that guy? He wanted everybody to vote, you know, and then there's been these guys that want people to vote on their computers. Well, anyway, a direct democracy says that everybody has a say. And in Athens, this was the case, although, of course, slaves couldn't vote, and women couldn't vote. So, I mean, as it turned out, only 10% of the people could vote anyway, but they would all go down into the marketplace and vote and discuss what they should do as a city. And in this context, you needed guys, if they were going to persuade people, who had loud voices, who could speak well, and who had rhetorical ability. And so there grew up a class of teachers who would teach people how to speak well, have great rhetorical skills. Now, whereas in the old days, in the days of the ancestors, the arete, the excellence of a person was his courage, his physical strength, you know, going out to battle. For these new guys, being back home, it's how well you could persuade the next guy, how many votes you can get, and maybe we can get the troops home, right? So these itinerant professional teachers taught for a fee, and they taught people how to argue, how to display rhetorical flourishes, right? How to make the stronger argument appear the weaker and the weaker argument appear the stronger, in order to finally get the votes you needed, to get the thing needed by you done, right? So now arete becomes identified with your ability to influence your fellow citizens. Well, Protagoras was a very famous sophist, and he famously said that man is the measure of all things, the things that are, and the things that are not, that are not. It's a very famous phrase from Protagoras. And if you think about this very much, you understand that what he's saying is there's really no objectivity to things apart from the human spin on things, right? Man is the measure of all things. So that the ontology, we know that word now because we talked about it last time, that is the being that exists is a function of how human beings classify things, and the values that seem to exist is a function of how human beings, the values are a function of how human beings tend to conceive things, how they value things. There is no absolute values in the world, it's that human beings value things in different ways. Now, there's been some talk about man as the measure of all things, whether it's completely subjective, this man, or whether it's cultural, these men. And it's probably the case that for Protagoras, man is the measure of all things, meaning culture is the measure of all things. So there would be some objectivity within a culture. The point is that there is no objectivity outside of human measurement. Now, I want to turn back the clock a bit to the pre-Socratics and their questions, and I'll come back with this lecture in a moment. Thank you.